Okay, scholars, this is the second time that I've done this video today because once I got my camera working, I found that the microphone was muted due to a Windows 10 update. You may have had some similar technological problems. I wasn't aware that the microphone wasn't working until I completed the video and began processing it to upload for you guys. So this is my second time, and maybe you'll get the better version now that I've had a chance to go through it once, only to find out that the microphone wasn't recording. This is Chapter 9, Global Stratification or Global Inequality. And you'll see some parallels between the chapter that we had on inequality in the United States and this chapter, but there are also some important differences. So what we're looking at here is we're beginning to compare the economic situations of different countries, different nations around the world. So in I believe it's chapter 8, we spent some time talking about inequality within the United States, and we talked about rural areas versus urban ghettos and things of that nature. But today we're going to talk about developed nations, industrialized nations, and developing nations, and the disparity and gap between those types of countries. So when we think about different countries, we think about our history, we can identify some countries that are doing very well economically. Of course, the United States has the largest economy in the world, and that's been the case for a number of years. However, China is now number 2, and they are growing very quickly, so it's likely that they will become the largest economy in the world. But we also have to remember that they have a population of well over 1 billion people. And here in the United States, our population is somewhere around 330 million, I believe. We're doing a census right now, so we should get some updated numbers on that sometime in early 2021. Okay, so we know that poverty is a problem here in the United States, but it's not all evenly spread out throughout the country. There are pockets of poverty, and the same is true when we look at the global poverty issue as well. We see that some countries are doing very well. Many of the European countries are doing pretty well right now relative to some of those nations in the sub-Saharan desert and India. Some of these countries are struggling. Some South American countries are struggling. So the question then becomes, well, why are these countries having so much trouble economically? Why are their economies not stronger? And there are a number of factors that we're going to talk about. There are 3 primary factors that sociologists believe are holding those countries back. First is a history of colonialism. And what we mean by colonialism is that if you think back 150, 200, 300 years ago, countries would wage war on each other to gain access to resources. Most conflicts have either been religious conflicts or conflicts over resources. And so, if we think about the British Empire, there was a time when there was a saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and what that meant was that no matter where it was daylight, that the Great Britain had colonies all around the world because they amassed large armies and sent them out to wage conquest against other people and to colonize them. And so India, some African countries, the United States started out as a British colony. Of course, before that it was the Romans, and before that the Egyptians. And so throughout history, we've had a number of countries that would wage war on neighboring populations and enslave or colonize those territories in order to exploit the raw resources, the iron ore, the spices, the sugar and salt supplies and things of that nature, various spices and things of that nature. So throughout history, human history is marked with a number of wars that were really focused on gaining control of the people and gaining their resources, their wealth. Okay, and so some historians have described war as theft on a global scale, on an international scale. So when you wage war on somebody, there is a desired outcome, and generally speaking, in the past, that has been land or other types of resources that could be exploited for the colonizing country. So we're going to talk about some of these countries that, a couple of centuries ago might not have even existed. We know that boundaries change as countries establish their independence from other entities. Bosnia-Herzegovina would be an example. If you think about the Baltic states that were part of the former Soviet Union, Ukraine, and some of those countries as well, Chechnya, those countries were part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union broke up, those countries established their sovereignty. Of course, India was a colony of Great Britain, and as I said, colonization has been a very significant part of human history, and it has set boundaries, and those boundaries have changed over the centuries and things of that nature. So we'll talk about all of that. So when we think about stratification on a global basis, the contrasts are sharp between those that are industrialized nations and those that we call developing countries. Okay, and as I said earlier, there are really three main factors that we're going to focus on. Colonialism, and now today neocolonialism is the first one. The second one we'll talk about is multinational corporations, which still have a tremendous amount of influence around the world. And modernization. Those are three variables that have really influenced which nations have had economic success and which have floundered and struggled and are still trying to achieve some economic success for not only for the country but for the citizens of that country, because certainly a country's economic well-being can be reflected in the citizens of those countries in most cases. So let's talk about colonialism. Colonialism is defined as a situation that occurs when a foreign power maintains political, social, economic, and cultural dominance over a people for an extended period of time. And so this largely disappeared by the 1980s. However, today we have something that has developed that we call neocolonialism, and we'll talk about that here momentarily. Even though most countries have now gained their sovereignty, a lot of times that freedom is not really genuine, and they still are in a dependent situation, depending on the, if not a colonizing power, dependent upon the multinational corporations that exist that can either choose to build a factory in their community and bring jobs, or can go somewhere else and exploit resources elsewhere. So, as I said, most nations that were colonies before World War I have achieved independence, but for many, that independence is really dependence on multinational corporations rather than a colonizing country now. Neocolonialism has replaced colonialism in many countries. This is the continued dependence on more industrialized nations for managerial and technical expertise by former colonies. So For example, if you're in a country that is trying to build an infrastructure, a highway infrastructure, and all the other things that have to happen in order to have factories and manufacturing facilities and things of that nature, you need educational opportunities for your citizens to develop the skills that they'll need to work in that environment. You need clean water and water supplies to the manufacturing facilities, particularly if that's especially important to the manufacturing process. You need energy, and so you have to build power plants and a grid to get that electricity and that power to the production facilities. And all of that takes expertise that the United States and other industrialized countries have developed, but many of these developing countries are behind, and so they still are dependent upon not only our countries, but on corporations within our countries that have developed expertise in those areas. Okay, and the world systems analysis is a description of an interdependent global economy that rests on unequal economic and political relationships. Nations do not constitute a whole system. We're all interdependent, and they exist within a larger global social context. So, we may have a country that's very close to us that has a different kind of political philosophy. For example, Cuba. And Cuba has been a communist country and ever since Fidel Castro led the overthrow of Cuba in the 1950s. He overthrew the existing government. His government was a communist government that was closely aligned with the former Soviet Union. And that has really made it very difficult for Cuba to experience significant economic growth, and partly because the United States has, carried on an embargo against Cuba. We refused to buy any of their products, and we've tried to discourage other democratic countries from doing business with Cuba because we disagreed with their political structure and their political philosophy. And so we all exist on the same planet. We have needs of each other, and we want to trade. But the social aspects of it, the political aspects, can influence whether a country is encouraged to grow and form relationships outside itself, or whether those relationships are stunted. And so nations are either part of the core, which these are industrialized countries, the United States, Britain, France, Germany. Those countries are considered to be core nations. Then we have what are called semi-peripheral nations, and that would include countries like Mexico and China, although I think it's getting harder to call China a semi-peripheral country when they have the second largest economy in the world. But the thing that separates China from many other core nations is that people in rural areas in China still live very much like it's in the 1930s or 1940s, whereas the urban dwellers in China live in modern cities, very, very large modern cities, but much of the population of China still lives in rural areas, and it's extremely impoverished in many of those rural areas. And the technological advances are way behind what's going on in the cities. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit more about these core and peripheral cities, and we'll talk about the legacy of colonialism. Here we're talking about exploitative relationships towards from the core nations towards the non-core nations. So we build factories in nations that are less developed than we are because they offer cheaper labor. They typically do not have the kind of environmental protection legislation and regulations that we have here in the United States, and so it's cheaper to do business there. You don't have to make sure that all the water that's released into the local river is clean, or that the stuff coming out of the smokestacks is free of pollution. And so it's much cheaper to do business in many of those countries. Labor unions often don't work in those countries. So it's kind of a situation where the wealthy nations are exploiting the poorer nations for their resources, those resources being human power, the workers in the factory, the cheaper work products, the cheaper raw resources, the cheaper energy, the lack of regulations. All of that makes it much cheaper to build a factory in a developing country than it is to build a factory in the United States or some of these other core nations. So dependency theory is a macro level theory that says that developing nations make economic advances, but they remain subservient to the core nations, very much as the proletariat are subservient to the bourgeoisie in a capitalist society, right? So you could kind of look at the core nations, the industrialized nations, as being the bourgeoisie, and the poorer nations as being the proletariat, and there being exploitation between those two types of countries in terms of the way they conduct business. Colonialism has also contributed to a growing share of human and natural resources in developing countries that's redistributed to core industrialized nations. And one example of this is what we call brain drain. We bring people to the United States who have very valuable skills. We had a nursing shortage a few years ago, and we sent people to the Philippines and other countries looking for well-trained nurses, and we brought them here to the United States along with a lot of other medical workers, and that has resulted in brain drain in the Philippines and other countries where we have, encouraged those people to come to the United States with things like signing bonuses and help moving, and lured them with stories of economic success and possibility. And certainly there's a lot of truth to it, but that has resulted in some of the best and brightest healthcare providers in other countries coming to the United States and leaving their home country with fewer healthcare workers. That dependency theory is going to focus on the fact that wealthy nations are taking advantage of and exploiting the poorer nations by using their people and their raw resources and their cheaper labor to produce products cheaper for themselves. So the reason that we can buy a television at Walmart for $300, a 4K TV for $300, is that TV is being produced in a factory in China that does not have the same kind of environmental regulations that we have here in the United States. The workers are not protected by a labor union, so the wages are very, very low. There's a high level of corruption in a lot of these political structures and things of that nature that allows us to exploit the people. And yes, there are some benefits to building factories in other countries to the local population, but typically they do not get their fair share. Okay, so when we think about developing nations, a lot of times they owe the core nations a lot of money, and we are increasingly pushing those developing nations to pay up, and in many cases their economies just can't support that kind of debt, to be quite honest with you. Globalization refers to a worldwide integration of government policies, cultures, social movements, and financial markets through trade and the exchange of ideas. And so globalization is not entirely bad, but it's not entirely good either, right? Because we see that some countries have to change their way of doing things in order to interact with the outside world. So we're kind of doing away with some of the diversity and some of the cultural variations that exist from one country to another by promoting this globalization. But as I said, there are some benefits to it, because certainly globalization has increased the standard of living in some communities. But, we assume that everyone wants to live their lives the way industrialized countries like the United States lives their lives. And that assumption is a little bit ethnocentristic in a lot of ways. Okay, so we've got those core nations. We've got the semi-peripheral nations that are developing, but they're still somewhat behind technologically and in terms of expertise and things of that nature. And then you've got the peripheral nations, Haiti and other countries like that are really, really struggling. And they're further behind technologically than the semi-peripheral nations. So when we look at the world in that context, we can see that core nations are doing very well relative to the semi-peripheral and certainly the peripheral nations. There are large concentrations of impoverished people in many of these peripheral nations, and even some of the semi-peripheral nations, as I mentioned in regards to China and India. There are also people in sub-Saharan Africa who are in very, very poor countries with very few resources that have been available to them. And of course, there are isolated areas of China and India, as I mentioned, that are also experiencing high rates of poverty. So, there's a lot of disagreement about where to draw the poverty line. When we talk about the United States, who should be considered living below the poverty line and who should not. When you start trying to do that on a global scale, it becomes a multiplicative problem because, there are lots of different standards of living around the world. You've got people who live in some developing nations where the children will not attend school because they can't afford to, and the children go on a daily basis to the landfill and pick out pieces of metal and other things that can be sold for recycling purposes and things of that nature, just in order to produce enough food to be able to purchase enough food for the family to survive. And every member of the family is expected to make an economic contribution to the family. And so children don't have the time or the wherewithal to go to school because they have to be out there, rag picking and metal picking, trying to help support the family. So you've got those semi-peripheral countries like that. And then you've got some peripheral countries where there are no factories and there are no jobs, and people are still living as hunter-gatherers or in very, very technologically backward, in our view, lifestyles because they just don't have that kind of infrastructure in their country. Those are diminishing. We're seeing fewer and fewer of those, and we kind of feel superior here in our industrialized society with our air conditioning and our jet fuel and all the, our transportation abilities and our technology, our cell phones, our smartphones and the internet and all of that. We kind of feel superior, but that's a little bit of an ethnocentristic view. Are our lives more valuable than the lives of a hunting and gathering tribe in Brazil? We might think so, but if we're being fair and trying to value all human life, our lives are really not any more valuable than theirs. And certainly the value of a human life shouldn't be measured in what somebody owns, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense that we're going to value rich people more than poor people. That's not what we say we value in the United States. But as industrialization has occurred, societies have gotten more and more materialistic. And today, he who has the most when he dies wins, right? Well, not really, but that's the way some people view it. We want to accumulate and acquire and accumulate more and more wealth. And, we tend to judge people's value by how much they've been able to accumulate. Well, so a number of nations back around the turn of the century really wanted to do something to try to combat poverty worldwide. And so these nations got together through the United Nations and created the Millennium Project. And the Millennium Project had 8 areas of focus. Their primary goal was to cut poverty, worldwide poverty, by 1/2. In the 1990s, we had about 2 billion people worldwide, maybe a little less than that, who were defined as living in poverty, and the goal was to cut that in half within 15 years. And they pretty much accomplished that goal. They had cut the number of people living in poverty by 2015 to a little over 800 million, almost 900 million people. And so that was considered to be a tremendous success, but there were still lots of areas that could have been improved upon, and a lot of that improvement did occur in China at the same time that China's economy was really exploding. So I'm not sure how much of it was due to the Millennium Project and how much of it was due to the fact that China allowed a certain amount of capitalism into their economy. They are still communist based, and politically they're still that way, but economically they allowed a level of capitalism to come in to their economic system, and that has allowed a tremendous explosion of production facilities and industrialization in China that has really grown their economy tremendously. So certainly the Millennium Project was useful in helping China, but there's still a great deal of poverty worldwide that needs to be addressed. But some of the areas that the Millennium Project wanted to try to focus on, they came up with 8 areas that they wanted to emphasize. They wanted to focus, of course, on poverty, as we mentioned, but they felt that one of the ways to do that was through education. And so the education systems in these countries were examined, and that was a target to, hey, let's improve education, because an educated populace is going to achieve greater upward mobility than an uneducated population. They also wanted to look at gender equality and inequality. In some countries, women are not allowed to work outside the home. In many countries, they're not allowed to own property, even their own home. And even though women around the world produce about half of the food for the world, they own very, very little of the property that food is produced on. So gender inequality has certainly been a concern. You might have read or seen recently that women in some Middle Eastern countries are now being allowed to drive and to move about their community without a male escort. In other words, a wife or a daughter oftentimes wouldn't be allowed to go somewhere on her own without having a male family member, a trusted male family member, escort her to and from her destination. So some of those countries are beginning to loosen some of the restrictions on women's movements and their ability to drive and perhaps even to work outside the home. But there's still a great deal of disparity from core nations to developing nations in that regard. Child mortality. One of the primary ways that we measure how well a country is doing is how many children, what percentage of unborn children die either during childbirth or in the first year after childbirth. Infant mortality rates are a pretty good indicator of how well a country is doing. Here in the United States, we have a relatively low infant mortality rate, overall, but there are areas, particularly poor areas in our country, where the infant mortality rates look more like developing nations. Okay, so if you want to improve the poverty situation in a country, you probably need to focus on decreasing the infant mortality rate, because these countries in many cases are characterized by families that have lots of kids, and the primary reason that they have lots of children Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, these were agricultural societies up until fairly recently, and as a farmer, you know that having free labor, having lots of kids, helps the family farm their land and produce more products. And so it takes a while when you become an industrialized country for people to start having smaller families. And also in these developing countries, if you've got a high infant mortality rate, you have to have lots of children so that maybe 2 or 3 of them will survive into adulthood, and you'll be able to then, when you are too old to care for yourself, you'll have children who are now adults who can care for you. But once we see infant mortality rates falling and we see life expectancy increasing, people tend to start to have fewer families because in an industrialized nation, children are not a financial asset, they're a liability. So, the United States now has a reproductive rate of about 1.8 children per married couple. So that puts us a little bit below replacement. If we get very restrictive on our immigration policies, we could see the United States actually experience negative growth in population because we're having fewer children. Okay. So child mortality, infant mortality rates are an important indicator of how well a country is doing economically. That has to do with access to prenatal care and neonatal care and all of those kinds of things. Maternal health. If you have a lot of women who are dying in childbirth, that means that they're not getting prenatal care and they're not properly nourished. And so that's certainly an issue. Disease. If people are dying of a lot of infectious diseases, now, let's not think about the pandemic in that regard. Think about normal situations. A pandemic is certainly not a normal situation, but in normal times, if you have a lot of people dying due to particularly communicable diseases, infectious diseases, that indicates that your country's not doing a very good job in terms of providing clean food and clean water and clean air. People are getting ill because of those infectious things in their environments. And even non-infectious diseases like cancer are influenced by how much pollution is in the environment. Some estimates suggest that as much as 90% of cancers are environmentally induced through the water that we drink, the food that we eat, the air that we breathe, the exposure to the sunlight. If we could limit all of those possible sources of cancer, cancer rates might fall by as much as 80 or 90%. Okay, so disease is another factor. Environment. Is the environment clean? Core nations tend to try to keep their environment clean because they understand the connection between health, disease, and pollution. Okay, and then global partnerships. These countries that are core countries have lots of partnerships. If we get into a tight, we've got partners around the world, or at least we have had in the past had a number of partners who were willing to help us tackle issues and things of that nature. But countries like Cuba that have been isolated because of their political and economic structure and their alliance with the former Soviet Union, countries like Cuba are going to struggle relative. Okay, so and they don't have the same kinds of global partnerships that countries like the United States have. Okay, so only 5 countries made financial contributions at the target level that was set by the United Nations into this Millennium Development Project. The United States gave relatively little based on its gross national income. Now you would say, well, wait a minute, we gave the most of any country in sheer dollars, and that's probably true, but when you consider that you have the largest economy in the world, that percentage that we gave was much smaller than countries that didn't have the same kind of economic growth that we've had. Okay, so yes, in terms of sheer dollars, we've given a lot, but in terms of that percentage of our gross national income, it was a much smaller percentage. The project almost met its goal to reduce poverty in half. As I said, 1.9 billion down to 836 billion living in poverty. But now their definition of poverty is where people have to live on less than $1.25 a day. So that's a pretty restrictive definition of poverty. But it's hard to measure poverty, as I said earlier. When you're looking at the United States, it's hard to measure poverty and figure out what the definition of poverty should be. And then when you expand that to the global stage, it's even more difficult to decide, well, what does it mean to live in poverty? But the definition that they agreed upon was people are living on less than $1.25 a day, or its equivalent in whatever currency we're talking about. Okay, China, as I said, accounted for most of the improvement, and that means there's still a lot of work out there to be done in other countries. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, we've talked a little bit about colonialism. Let's talk a little bit about multinational corporations. These are companies like Standard Oil and Exxon and Mobil and various other companies. Microsoft today would be a transnational or a multinational corporation. Yes, they are based here in the United States, but they have offices around the world and they sell their products around the world. Multinational corporations are defined as commercial organizations that are headquartered in one country but do business throughout the world. They buy, trade, and produce goods all over the globe. They are beginning to establish what we would call reservation services and data processing centers in periphery nations. So if you want to buy a product or a service from these companies, you can go online or you can call a number that's to a call center somewhere else on the planet, and they are relocating those to India and other countries because of the amount of money that it costs to run such an entity here in the United States versus these peripheral nations. Okay. The total revenue for some corporations eclipses that of entire nations. So the print is really small and I'm having a little difficulty reading it, but if you look at figure 9-4, you can see that there are a number of companies that have more revenue coming in than entire nations. There's a list there of 10 or 12, I think, companies compared to countries where their economies, the money that they're generating, the revenue that they're generating exceeds that of entire nations. Okay, so let's talk about these from the sociological perspectives. The functionalists are going to say that these multinational corporations are going in and they're building production facilities and they're contributing to the infrastructure by building water treatment plants and drilling wells where there was no well before. They're developing sanitation systems and streets and things of that nature, and they're contributing to the educational opportunities in the communities. And so therefore they're helping those countries, and they're helping our country by producing products at a lower price so that Americans can afford to buy $300 4K TVs, right? And they're not wrong. The functionalists are not wrong about that. Those are certainly some benefits, but that's only looking at the benefits. The conflict theorists, on the other hand, are going to point out that, well, yes, these companies are doing these kinds of things, but they're paying these workers very, very low wages. Yes, it's more than they were making before, but relative to American workers' wages, they're minuscule, and therefore those companies are not lifting those people out of poverty. They're still being exploited. And now these factories are spewing water pollution and air pollution into the environment. And at the same time, using the resources, the raw resources, whether that's minerals or, oil for producing electricity or whatever, we're using all of those things up. And when that country then wants to develop its economy further without these multinational corporations, they're incapable of doing so. So, they're going to focus, the conflict there is they're going to focus on the exploitation of the workforce, of the lack of environmental protections, the political structure, and all of those kinds of things to keep those countries dependent upon the corporations and the wealthy countries, while not really benefiting those poorer countries as much as they should. So, two radically different views of this neocolonialism, or these multinational corporations. And then we have modernization. And modernization is a far-reaching process through which periphery nations move from traditional or less developed institutions to those characteristic of more developed societies. And we tend to assume that that's always good, that modernization is always a good thing. That's probably a little ethnocentristic and a little bit short-sighted, but that's can't stand in the way of progress, can't stand in the way of modernization. It's kind of our mantra, particularly in capitalist societies, right? So the members of society must shift their allegiance from traditional authorities, perhaps religious authorities, or a king or whatever, to newer ones. For example, government officials. There's that ethnocentricity that's surrounds this idea that modern is necessarily better. The Amish in our own society have decided that modern and modernization is not necessarily better, and so they have decided to avoid using technological advances that radically change their lives. They want to remain farmers, and they don't want mechanization and technology to radically change the way they live their lives. And there are people around the world who want to stay away and avoid industrialization because they see some of the negatives that come with all of that. So the question, I guess, then becomes, are you happier just because you have a lot of things, or are you happy? And some of the poorest people economically that I've known have been some of the happiest people I've known. They don't have the same kinds of stresses, and they're not owned by their material wealth. If you're making a $400, $500 a month car payment, or a $700 a month car payment, do you own that car, or does the car own you? Does the bank own you? And so, it's always nice to have better food and a better house to protect you from the elements. But if the cost of that is that you have to work yourself to death and be in debt all your life, maybe living on a farm in a very simple home and growing enough food for your family and for your neighbors, maybe that's a better lifestyle, or maybe that has appeal to a lot of people in society. So modernization may not be the ultimate goal for everybody in the world, and we need to keep that in mind. That term modernization suggests positive change, but not all the change. All the cancers that we get today are that's one of the negatives that might come with industrialized life. Modernization theory is a functionalist approach that basically proposes that modernization and development will gradually improve the lives of people in developing nations. And as I said, I think there is some validity to that, but you have to see those things as positives and as good things, or modernization is much less attractive. Proponents say the development of periphery nations will be assisted by innovations transferred from core nations, and critics say that technological transfers just increase the power of one nation and facilitate further exploitation. Of course, that's going to be the conflict theorists, right? They're going to say that you're just exploiting these people and getting them further and further in debt to you so that you can continue that exploitation. So I want to talk just a minute or two about the distribution of wealth internationally. We see that worldwide, the richest 2%, so we've got about 7 billion people on the planet. The richest 2% of those 7 billion own half of the wealth in the world. That's similar to what we saw when we looked at wealth distribution in the United States, right? In at least 19 nations, the most affluent 10% receive at least 50% of all income. So down there at the very bottom of the structure, people, there's very little left for those folks. Okay, so you can look at the distribution of wealth and income in a number of different countries in Figure 9-5, and that will show you that the disparity is pretty bleak and pretty stark. Okay. Now, I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about mobility in these developing countries versus mobility in industrial nations. In industrialized nations like the United States, the idea is that, the old American dream is if you come to the United States as an immigrant and you work hard and you study hard and you develop some skills, that you can achieve upward mobility. Although we're making it a lot harder for people to immigrate to the United States today, at a time when our population isn't really growing very fast due to fewer children. So fewer people are seeing that American dream come true for them. But anyway, on a global scale, the same kind of thing happens. We can look at some of the factors that influence mobility in other countries. Some countries have very, very low rates of mobility from the underclass or the lower class to the middle class. Most of the mobility that we do see in developing countries is from the very poor into a working class or middle class. Very little of it is from the working class into the upper class. So there's much less mobility in most other countries, particularly these peripheral nations that we're talking about. Much less mobility. That's why America was seen as this land of opportunity for many decades. So then when we look further at these developing countries, we see that the mobility of women is in some cases non-existent. Their only opportunity for real mobility is to marry a wealthy man, because in some of these countries, as I said earlier, you've got some countries where women are not even allowed to own their own homes. And so they are utterly dependent upon the males in their lives. As I said, we've got those gender differences in mobility. Women face sex discrimination from birth. We see that female children in other countries are often fed less than their male counterparts. They are given fewer educational opportunities, and in some cases denied educational opportunities, or only allowed to go through middle school or perhaps high school, while males are allowed to go to college and seek higher education. We see that some females in countries like China face higher rates of being aborted as fetuses or being killed as children, and there's a higher rate of exploitation, including sexual exploitation, in a lot of those developing nations. China had a one-child rule for a number of years, trying to control population growth. The problem with that was that because male children are more highly desired and valued in China, if your first child was a female, some of those children would be killed so that the couple could have another child, hoping for a male. That started creating such gender ratio problems. There weren't enough females for the males that were growing up to have their own spouses, that China relaxed their rule. So if your first child was a female, you could have a second child, but that didn't, if you wanted to have a third child, there were economic penalties. So if your first two children were both female, you were left without a son. Or if you did have a son, you had to pay some additional taxes and penalties. Okay, that encouraged families to kill female children at fairly high rates compared to countries that didn't have such kind of regulations on family growth. Okay, here in the United States, we can't even imagine what it would be like to have those kinds of policies. Okay, all right, so I think that's about what I wanted to cover from Chapter 9. Of course, you're responsible for all the material in Chapter 9 and the other chapters that we cover, but I will focus on the stuff that I'm going to ask questions about on the exam. So we're here towards the end of the semester. We're getting close. The last few weeks of the semester are going to be very, very busy. Stay on top of things. Communicate with me if you're having trouble. Let's get this stuff done. And have a good holiday. Have a good break. But most importantly, stay healthy. Take care of yourselves and your family members. Try to be smart about social distancing and wearing masks and being careful during this pandemic. Yes, you young folks are less likely to have serious complications from COVID, but if you're coming in contact with family members at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and you are asymptomatic but carrying the virus with you, that poses a risk to your elderly loved ones. I'm getting to the stage now where I kind of consider myself an elderly one, so but I have parents who are in their 70s and 80s, and other family members that I want to be very careful to try to protect them from this really horrible illness. So stay safe, have a good break, guys, and let's finish strong. We've got about a little over 3 weeks till the end of the semester, so let's lock and load and get busy and get this stuff done and have a successful semester. And stay safe, okay? Thank you.